In the past week, Russia's military has faced some of its worst setbacks since the war began. On October 1, 2024, Russian forces were forced to abandon key positions in eastern Ukraine as Ukrainian troops launched a surprising counteroffensive that quickly reclaimed territory in Luhansk and Donetsk. Russian tanks, once thought to be invincible, were seen burning in the streets as Ukrainian forces launched a devastating assault on supply lines that had been crucial to Russia's advance. The Russian military, which had expected to easily dominate the battlefield, is now facing a desperate retreat, struggling to maintain control over regions it once thought were firmly under its grasp. This turn of events has sent shockwaves through the international community, with US military leaders now quietly preparing for a much greater involvement. The question on everyone's mind is, could this be the moment when the US is finally forced to intervene directly in the war? With NATO strengthening its presence along Eastern Europe and the US offering more advanced weaponry to Ukraine, the threat of a broader conflict looms larger than ever. October 15, 2024 could be a defining moment. As the world braces for the potential of a major counterattack, we ask, is Russia about to face its most destructive blow yet? The Russia-Ukraine conflict has been one of the most significant geopolitical events of the 21st century. What began as a territorial dispute has since grown into a global crisis involving not only Ukraine and Russia, but also major international powers like the United States and NATO. In February 2022, Russia escalated its involvement by launching a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, dramatically changing the course of the conflict and introducing the world to new levels of uncertainty. For Ukraine, the invasion threatened its very existence, while for the broader international community, it raised critical questions about the future of European stability, the rules-based international order, and the potential for a wider war. This is not the first time the world has witnessed Russian aggression against Ukraine. In 2014, Russia annexed Crimea, a move that was condemned by Ukraine and the international community, leading to sanctions and diplomatic isolation for Moscow. Around the same time, Russia backed separatist groups in Ukraine's Donetsk and Luhansk regions, further inflaming tensions between the two countries. The subsequent war in the Donbas region remained a simmering conflict for years, with occasional flare-ups of violence and periodic ceasefire agreements. However, it was not until February 2022 that Russia took its most aggressive step yet, sending thousands of troops across Ukraine's borders in an attempt to overthrow the Ukrainian government and assert Russian dominance over the region. The world watched in shock as Russian forces advanced rapidly, initially targeting Kyiv and other major cities. Despite the overwhelming size of the Russian military, Ukraine mounted a fierce defense, showing resilience and determination in the face of a much larger and better-equipped enemy. This resistance, coupled with the logistical challenges faced by the Russian military, caused significant delays in their objectives, forcing them to recalibrate their strategy and shift their focus to the eastern and southern regions of Ukraine. As the conflict unfolded, the United States took a leading role in supporting Ukraine. While the U.S. refrained from direct military involvement, it quickly pledged substantial military aid to Ukraine, including advanced weapons systems such as the Javelin anti-tank missile, the HIMARS rocket system, and air defense systems. Along with these weapons, the U.S. provided critical intelligence, satellite imagery, and strategic guidance to the Ukrainian military, helping them to level the playing field in some respects, giving the Ukrainian forces the tools they needed to fight back and slow the Russian advance. The U.S. also imposed a series of unprecedented sanctions on Russia, targeting its financial institutions, oligarchs, and military-industrial complex. These measures, aimed at crippling the Russian economy and limiting its ability to sustain the war effort, were backed by the European Union and other Western allies. The sanctions were intended to serve as both a punitive measure and a deterrent, hoping to undermine the Russian government and force President Vladimir Putin to reconsider his military objectives. However, despite the economic hardship, Russia remained defiant, continuing its aggression in Ukraine and deepening its ties with countries like China and Iran to counterbalance the Western sanctions. NATO, the military alliance that includes the US and most European countries, also played a significant role in the conflict, although it stopped short of direct military involvement in Ukraine. NATO's primary focus was to deter Russian aggression against its member states, particularly those in Eastern Europe, who feared they might be next on Russia's list of targets. The alliance began to bolster its defenses in countries like Poland, Romania, and the Baltic states, increasing its military presence and conducting regular training exercises with US forces. NATO's strategy was one of deterrence, making it clear that any attack on a NATO member would be met with a swift and forceful response, thereby reducing the likelihood that Russia would extend its military operations into NATO territory. While NATO provided significant military aid to Ukraine, its leaders were careful not to directly engage Russian forces, aware that such an action could easily lead to a broader, more destructive war. The line between supporting Ukraine and directly confronting Russia became increasingly blurred as the conflict progressed, with the US and its allies walking a fine line between escalating the war and avoiding a direct military confrontation with the Russian Federation. In the midst of this growing tension, the question of US involvement has remained a topic of intense debate. The US has sent billions of dollars in military and humanitarian aid to Ukraine, but has stayed out of direct combat. Yet, as the war has continued to evolve, some analysts have raised concerns that the US may eventually be forced to take a more active role, particularly if Russia escalates its attacks, or if NATO's defense commitments are triggered. Could the US military be preparing for a direct confrontation with Russian forces? What would happen if the situation spirals out of control and the US finds itself in a direct conflict with the Russian Federation? The risk of further escalation is evident, especially as Russia faces mounting setbacks on the battlefield. The continued pressure on Russian forces, particularly in the eastern regions of Ukraine, could lead to more aggressive actions from Moscow in an attempt to salvage its objectives. As the conflict drags on, the US and its allies must consider the possibility of a direct strike on Russian positions, especially if they perceive that Russian actions are threatening the broader security of Europe or the global order. At the same time, the US military continues to prepare for a range of potential scenarios. The presence of US forces in Europe, particularly in countries like Poland, has increased as part of a broader strategy to deter Russian aggression. These forces, while not directly involved in the fighting in Ukraine, serve as a strategic deterrent and ensure that the US and NATO are prepared to respond rapidly if the conflict spreads beyond Ukraine's borders. The US military has conducted numerous exercises with NATO allies, showcasing its readiness to deploy forces quickly to defend its interests and protect its allies. This posture is a reminder that while the US has not yet entered the war directly, it is actively preparing for the possibility that a full-scale confrontation with Russia could become inevitable. In conclusion, the conflict between Russia and Ukraine has reached a critical juncture, with the US and NATO playing a pivotal role in shaping the outcome. While the US has provided extensive support to Ukraine, it has stopped short of direct military involvement, opting instead for indirect assistance through arms supplies, intelligence sharing, and economic sanctions. However, the risk of escalation remains high, and the question of how far the US is willing to go in supporting Ukraine continues to loom large. As the war unfolds, the US and its allies must carefully navigate the complex dynamics of the conflict, balancing support for Ukraine with the need to avoid triggering a broader war with Russia. The war in Ukraine, now more than a year in duration, has created an evolving geopolitical landscape, and the US military's involvement is a key component of the West's strategy to counter Russia's aggression. While American troops have avoided direct combat with Russian forces, the US military's presence in Europe has significantly increased, and the readiness of US forces stationed abroad has been a critical factor in the ability to support Ukraine without pushing the conflict into direct war with Russia. In this chapter, we examine how the U.S. military is mobilizing, the assets it has on the ground, and the strategies it may employ if the situation escalates further. From the very beginning of Russia's invasion, the U.S. has played a central role in arming and training Ukrainian forces. The Biden administration quickly authorized billions of dollars in military aid, sending advanced weapon systems to Ukraine in an attempt to bolster its ability to defend itself against the much larger Russian military. These weapons included anti-tank missiles like the Javelin, HIMARS rocket systems, Stinger missiles, and air defense systems like the Patriot missile defense system, among others. The U.S. has also provided critical intelligence sharing to help Ukraine target key Russian military assets, enabling Ukrainian forces to make highly strategic strikes against Russian supply lines, airfields, and other key infrastructure. Despite this massive support, U.S. forces have not directly engaged Russian troops on the battlefield. However, the U.S. military's presence in Europe has grown in response to the growing threat posed by Russia. The U.S. has deployed additional troops and military hardware to Eastern European countries like Poland, Romania, and the Baltic states, where they work alongside NATO allies to bolster defenses against any potential Russian aggression. These countries, which share borders with Russia and Belarus, are seen as highly vulnerable in the event of further Russian expansion into Eastern Europe. By stationing U.S. forces in these countries, the U.S. ensures that NATO's eastern flank remains secure, while also sending a clear message to Russia that any attack on NATO members will be met with a swift response. One of the key strategies that the U.S. military has employed in its support of Ukraine has been the training and equipping of Ukrainian forces. American military advisors have worked closely with Ukrainian troops, providing them with training on advanced systems like the HIMARS rocket launchers, anti-aircraft systems, and counter-drone technologies. This training has allowed Ukrainian forces to become more proficient in using cutting-edge technologies that have proven critical in the battlefield against Russian forces. The U.S. also provides intelligence and surveillance support, using satellites, drones, and other assets to give Ukrainian commanders real-time battlefield updates and targeting information. This has enabled Ukrainian forces to launch more effective strikes, including the destruction of Russian supply convoys, air defense systems, and even Russian warships in the Black Sea. Though the U.S. has remained careful to avoid direct confrontation with Russian forces, its support for Ukraine has grown increasingly sophisticated. In addition to providing weapons, the U.S. has helped to modernize Ukraine's military infrastructure, ensuring that its forces are better equipped to withstand the prolonged conflict. But as the war continues, there are growing concerns that direct U.S. involvement might become inevitable. The further the war drags on, the more pressure the U.S. government faces to ensure Ukraine's success and to prevent Russia from solidifying its territorial gains. As Russia continues to experience setbacks on the battlefield and suffers heavy casualties, its response to the U.S. and NATO's involvement has grown more aggressive. Russian President Vladimir Putin has consistently warned of the dangers of NATO's interference in Ukraine and has threatened to expand his military objectives to include attacks on NATO infrastructure in Eastern Europe. In response to these threats, the U.S. has deployed more troops to the region, particularly in countries that are most vulnerable to Russian aggression. These deployments are part of a broader effort to enhance NATO's deterrence capability, ensuring that any Russian attack to cross into NATO territory will be met with a strong military response. One of the key strategies that the U.S. military has employed in its support of Ukraine has been the training and equipping of Ukrainian forces. American military advisors have worked closely with Ukrainian troops, providing them with training on advanced systems like the HIMARS rocket launchers, anti-aircraft systems, and counter-drone technologies. This training has allowed Ukrainian forces to become more proficient in using cutting-edge technologies that have proven critical in the battlefield against Russian forces. The U.S. also provides intelligence and surveillance support, using satellites, drones, and other assets to give Ukrainian commanders real-time battlefield updates and targeting information. This has enabled Ukrainian forces to launch more effective strikes, including the destruction of Russian supply convoys, air defense systems, and even Russian warships in the Black Sea. Though the US has remained careful to avoid direct confrontation with Russian forces, its support for Ukraine has grown increasingly sophisticated. In addition to providing weapons, the US has helped to modernize Ukraine's military infrastructure, ensuring that its forces are better equipped to withstand the prolonged conflict. But as the war continues, there are growing concerns that direct US involvement might become inevitable. The further the war drags on, the more pressure the US government faces to ensure Ukraine's success and to prevent Russia from solidifying its territorial gains. As Russia continues to experience setbacks on the battlefield and suffers heavy casualties, its response to the US and NATO's involvement has grown more aggressive. Russian President Vladimir Putin has consistently warned of the dangers of NATO's interference in Ukraine and has threatened to expand his military objectives to include attacks on NATO infrastructure in Eastern Europe. In response to these threats, the US has deployed more troops to the region, particularly in countries that are most vulnerable to Russian aggression. These deployments are part of a broader effort to enhance NATO's deterrence capability, ensuring that any Russian attack to cross into NATO territory will be met with a strong military response. One of the key strategies that the US military has employed in its support of Ukraine has been the training and equipping of Ukrainian forces. American military advisors have worked closely with Ukrainian troops, providing them with training on advanced systems like the HIMARS rocket launchers, anti-aircraft systems, and counter-drone technologies. This training has allowed Ukrainian forces to become more proficient in using cutting-edge technologies that have proven critical in the battlefield against Russian forces. The US also provides intelligence and surveillance support, using satellites, drones, and other assets to give Ukrainian commanders real-time battlefield updates and targeting information. This has enabled Ukrainian forces to launch more effective strikes, including the destruction of Russian supply convoys, air defense systems, and even Russian warships in the Black Sea. Though the US has remained careful to avoid direct confrontation with Russian forces, its support for Ukraine has grown increasingly sophisticated. In addition to providing weapons, the US has helped to modernize Ukraine's military infrastructure, ensuring that its forces are better equipped to withstand the prolonged conflict. But as the war continues, there are growing concerns that direct US involvement might become inevitable. The further the war drags on, the more pressure the US government faces to ensure Ukraine's success and to prevent Russia from solidifying its territorial gains. As Russia continues to experience setbacks on the battlefield and suffers heavy casualties, its response to the US and NATO's involvement has grown more aggressive. Russian President Vladimir Putin has consistently warned of the dangers of NATO's interference in Ukraine and has threatened to expand his military objectives to include attacks on NATO infrastructure in Eastern Europe. In response to these threats, the US has deployed more troops to the region, particularly in countries that are most vulnerable to Russian aggression. These deployments are part of a broader effort to enhance NATO's deterrence capability, ensuring that any Russian attack to cross into NATO territory will be met with a strong military response. One of the key strategies that the US military has employed in its support of Ukraine has been the training and equipping of Ukrainian forces. American military advisors have worked closely with Ukrainian troops, providing them with training on advanced systems like the HIMARS rocket launchers, anti-aircraft systems, and counter-drone technologies. This training has allowed Ukrainian forces to become more proficient in using cutting-edge technologies that have proven critical in the battlefield against Russian forces. The US also provides intelligence and surveillance support, using satellites, drones, and other assets to give Ukrainian commanders real-time battlefield updates and targeting information. This has enabled Ukrainian forces to launch more effective strikes, including the destruction of Russian supply convoys, air defense systems, and even Russian warships in the Black Sea. Though the US has remained careful to avoid direct confrontation with Russian forces, its support for Ukraine has grown increasingly sophisticated. In addition to providing weapons, the US has helped to modernize Ukraine's military infrastructure, ensuring that its forces are better equipped to withstand the prolonged conflict. But as the war continues, there are growing concerns that direct US involvement might become inevitable. The further the war drags on, the more pressure the US government faces to ensure Ukraine's success and to prevent Russia from solidifying its territorial gains. As Russia continues to experience setbacks on the battlefield and suffers heavy casualties, its response to the US and NATO's involvement has grown more aggressive. Russian President Vladimir Putin has consistently warned of the dangers of NATO's interference in Ukraine and has threatened to expand his military objectives to include attacks on NATO infrastructure in Eastern Europe. In response to these threats, the US has deployed more troops to the region, particularly in countries that are most vulnerable to Russian aggression. These deployments are part of a broader effort to enhance NATO's deterrence capability, ensuring that any Russian attempt to cross into NATO territory will be met with a strong military response. The US military's preparation for potential escalation is also seen in the strengthening of its missile defense systems across Eastern Europe. The Patriot missile defense system, which is capable of intercepting both ballistic and cruise missiles, has been deployed to countries like Poland and Romania. These systems are designed to prevent Russian missiles from reaching NATO territories, particularly if Russia were to escalate the conflict by launching long-range strikes against key infrastructure in neighboring NATO member states. In addition, the US has increased the number of fighter jets and airborne surveillance assets in the region, ensuring that NATO has the air superiority needed to protect its borders and respond to any potential Russian threats. While the US has remained largely cautious in its direct military engagements, it has made it clear that any attack on US forces or NATO members will result in a rapid response. The US military maintains a high level of readiness in the region, constantly preparing for the possibility that Russia will target NATO infrastructure or move its forces closer to NATO borders. For the US, the geopolitical stakes in this conflict are high, not only because of its commitment to Ukraine's sovereignty, but also because of its desire to maintain the credibility of NATO. If the US and its allies fail to defend NATO's eastern members against Russian threats, it could severely damage the alliance's credibility and embolden Russia to expand further. But what happens if Russia crosses the threshold? If it attacks a NATO member state, it would trigger Article 5 of the NATO Treaty, which mandates that all member states come to the defense of the country under attack. This would mean that the US, along with its NATO allies, would be obligated to respond militarily. While the hope is that diplomacy and deterrence will prevent such an escalation, the risk of direct confrontation remains ever present. As the situation continues to unfold, many military analysts are wondering what kind of military strategies the US might deploy if it is pushed into a direct conflict with Russia. While much depends on how the conflict progresses, one possibility is that the US could begin to engage in more aggressive cyber warfare against Russian infrastructure. The US has long maintained a robust cyber warfare capability, and in a situation where conventional military strikes could escalate the conflict into nuclear warfare, cyber attacks could serve as a means of disrupting Russian military operations without directly attacking Russian forces. In addition to cyber warfare, the US could also engage in long-range strikes against Russian military infrastructure. The US has a wide array of strategic capabilities, including bombers, missile systems, and naval assets capable of targeting Russian command centers, missile launch sites, and other critical infrastructure. These strikes would likely be intended to degrade Russia's ability to conduct military operations while minimizing the risk of direct confrontation on the battlefield. However, even these forms of indirect military engagement could provoke a Russian response, potentially escalating the conflict to levels that neither side can afford. As the war continues to evolve, the US military remains in a state of constant readiness, preparing for any scenario. While no one can predict exactly what will happen next, the possibility of direct US military action against Russia becomes increasingly plausible as the conflict drags on. In the next sections, we will explore the role of NATO in this equation, the potential triggers for a full-scale U.S. military response, and the broader implications of such an escalation for global security. As the Russia-Ukraine war drags on, the role of NATO has become more crucial than ever. The alliance's position is a delicate balancing act between supporting Ukraine without directly engaging in combat with Russia, while also ensuring that Russia does not escalate its aggression to the point where it threatens NATO's core security commitments. Since the beginning of the conflict, NATO has consistently condemned Russia's actions, providing military and logistical support to Ukraine. But it has carefully avoided crossing the threshold into direct military confrontation. However, the risk of this happening grows with each passing day, and the actions of both Russia and NATO are becoming increasingly interconnected. NATO's response to the war in Ukraine has been one of solidarity and deterrence rather than direct intervention. The alliance has provided critical support to Ukraine in the form of military aid, intelligence sharing, and training for Ukrainian forces. NATO has also bolstered its defenses along its eastern border, particularly in countries that are most vulnerable to Russian aggression, such as Poland, the Baltic states, and Romania. These countries, located on the front lines of the conflict, fear that they may be the next targets of Russian expansion if Ukraine falls. To reassure these member states and prevent Russia from testing NATO's resolve, the alliance has increased its military presence in the region. This increased presence includes the stationing of additional NATO troops in Eastern Europe, as well as the deployment of advanced air defense systems, fighter jets, and surveillance assets. These measures are designed to enhance NATO's deterrence capability, making it clear that any attack on a NATO member would trigger a collective response under Article 5 of the NATO Treaty. Article 5 is the cornerstone of NATO's defense strategy, and it stipulates that an attack is reactive rather than proactive, and the question of whether it is doing enough to protect its member states is one that is becoming increasingly urgent. In recent months, Russia has stepped up its threats against NATO countries, with increased military activity along the borders of countries like Poland, Latvia, and Lithuania. These actions, coupled with Russia's growing isolation from the West, have raised concerns that Putin may be preparing for a broader confrontation that goes beyond Ukraine. At the same time, NATO is also facing internal challenges. While the alliance has largely been united in its support for Ukraine, there are differing views among member states about how far the alliance should go in its involvement. Countries like the United States, the United Kingdom, and Poland have been vocal in their support for stronger actions, including more direct military assistance to Ukraine. Other countries like Germany and France have been more cautious, advocating for diplomacy and negotiations as the primary means of resolving the conflict. These internal divisions have created challenges for NATO as it tries to navigate the complex dynamics of the Russia-Ukraine war. As the war progresses, the question of NATO's future role is becoming more urgent. Will NATO continue to provide support to Ukraine, or will it eventually decide to intervene directly? And if NATO does decide to intervene, what will be the consequences for the broader global security environment? The answers to these questions depend largely on the actions of Russia, and whether it continues its aggressive military tactics or takes steps towards negotiation. NATO's role also extends beyond its military posture. It has been working to strengthen its political cohesion and increase support for Ukraine within the international community. One of NATO's key objectives has been to prevent Russia from isolating Ukraine diplomatically. Since the invasion began, NATO has worked to rally the international community around the idea that Ukraine's sovereignty must be protected, and that Russia's actions are a direct challenge to the post-World War II international order. This diplomatic effort has been essential in maintaining the sanctions regime against Russia, which has placed significant pressure on the Russian economy. Another key element of NATO's strategy is its efforts to maintain unity within the alliance. As the war continues, the alliance must ensure that all member states remain committed to its collective defense obligations, as well as to the support of Ukraine. This is not a small task, especially with the increasing economic and political strain that the conflict is placing on member countries. The rise in energy prices, the economic toll of sanctions on Russia, and the refugee crisis stemming from the war are all factors that could test NATO's resolve. Maintaining political cohesion among its members will be critical to ensuring that NATO can continue to effectively respond to the crisis and that the alliance does not fracture under the pressure of the ongoing war. In the face of these challenges, NATO's future course of action will likely hinge on the developments on the battlefield. If the Ukrainian military continues to make significant gains, NATO may be more inclined to continue its support, both militarily and diplomatically. However, if Russia is able to regroup and launch a major counteroffensive, it could lead to a scenario where NATO feels compelled to take more drastic measures to protect its member states and deter further Russian expansion. The situation is fluid, and the risk of escalation remains high. One of the most pressing questions is whether NATO will eventually be forced to engage in a direct military conflict with Russia. While the alliance has maintained its stance of non-engagement, the reality is that as the war in Ukraine becomes more intense and Russia's threats to NATO countries increase, NATO may eventually face a point of no return. If Russia escalates its attacks on NATO member states, particularly in the Baltic or Poland, NATO will be compelled to act, invoking Article 5 and potentially leading to a full-scale war between Russia and the West. The possibility of such an escalation is something that NATO and its leaders are keenly aware of, but it is a risk they are determined to avoid, at least for now. In summary, NATO's role in the Russia-Ukraine conflict is one of careful management and deterrence. While the alliance has supported Ukraine extensively, it has been reluctant to directly engage in combat with Russian forces, fearing that such a move could escalate into a larger war. As the situation continues to evolve, NATO's strategy will likely adapt to the changing dynamics on the ground. But one thing is clear, the alliance is prepared to defend its members and will not hesitate to act if the security of NATO countries is threatened. The question remains, however, whether NATO's role will be enough to prevent a larger conflict, or whether the war in Ukraine will eventually pull the alliance into direct confrontation with Russia. As the conflict between Russia and Ukraine continues, the possibility of further escalation looms larger than ever. The United States has managed to avoid direct military confrontation with Russian forces thus far, but the longer the war drags on, the more likely it becomes that direct engagement will be unavoidable. The question that many analysts and policymakers are asking is what might trigger such an escalation, a point at which the United States would have to act militarily against Russia. While the US has thus far opted for indirect involvement, supporting Ukraine through military aid, intelligence sharing, and economic sanctions, several potential scenarios could push the conflict into a new, more dangerous phase. One of the most immediate and serious triggers would be if Russia were to launch an attack on a NATO member state. NATO's Article 5 is the cornerstone of the alliance, stating that an attack on one member is an attack on all. If Russia were to target a NATO country, particularly one of its eastern members like Poland or the Baltic states, it would trigger a military response from the US and its allies. The escalation of the war to the point where a NATO member is attacked would transform the conflict from a regional war into a global confrontation, potentially involving the full might of NATO's military forces. The possibility of such an event is ever present, especially as Russia has repeatedly made threats against NATO members, particularly in Eastern Europe. Another critical trigger would be the use of weapons of mass destruction by Russia, such as chemical, biological, or even nuclear weapons. Russia has often hinted at its willingness to escalate in this manner, and as its military position weakens, Putin may consider resorting to WMDs as a last-ditch effort to change the course of the war. If Russia were to deploy chemical or biological agents in Ukraine, or worse, resort to a tactical nuclear strike, the US would almost certainly be forced to respond with a military retaliation. The use of such weapons would cross a red line, prompting the United States to engage Russia in ways that might include direct strikes on Russian military positions or key infrastructure. While the US has remained cautious about direct military engagement, the situation could change if Russian forces target US military personnel or assets. The US has been heavily involved in supporting Ukraine through intelligence sharing, arms supplies, and military training. And while American troops have avoided direct combat, there are thousands of military advisors, contractors, and logistical personnel in and around the conflict zones. If Russian forces were to attack US personnel, particularly in countries like Poland or Romania, it would provoke a military response from the United States, escalating the war into a direct confrontation. The risk of such an attack has been a constant concern, and the US has taken significant steps to protect its personnel from being targeted. Another possible trigger for US involvement could come from a shift in the global dynamics as a result of Russia's actions elsewhere in the world. The US has a vast network of allies and interests outside of Europe, and if Russia were to target American interests in regions like the Middle East or Central Asia, the US might be forced to respond. For example, if Russia were to escalate tensions with US allies like Israel or Saudi Arabia, the US would have to act to protect its interests and maintain its influence in these key regions. While the focus has primarily been on Ukraine, the war in Europe could have ripple effects that draw the United States into wider conflicts. Perhaps the most worrying scenario is one where Russia's position weakens to point of collapse. If Ukrainian forces continue to push back Russian troops and Russia faces major defeats on the battlefield, there could be a desperate shift in Russian strategy. With domestic pressure mounting, Putin might feel cornered and decide to escalate further, whether through cyber warfare, regional conflicts, or even full-scale attacks on NATO. A desperate Russia would be a far more dangerous entity, as it might engage in reckless actions to salvage its position. In such a scenario, the US would be forced to consider a more aggressive stance to protect its allies. The nuclear risk is another factor that cannot be overlooked. Though unlikely, the possibility of Russia using its nuclear arsenal remains a threat that casts a dark shadow over the conflict. Both the US and Russia have arsenals capable of destroying each other and much of the world, and while the use of such weapons is considered a last resort, it cannot be ruled out entirely. If Russia were to use nuclear weapons, whether in Ukraine or against NATO, it would provoke an immediate and catastrophic response from the United States, likely leading to an all-out war. This is a scenario that both sides want to avoid, but the risk of nuclear escalation is present nonetheless. The US would need to weigh every action carefully, knowing that one misstep could lead to a conflict of unimaginable consequences. As we look toward the future, the stakes in the Russia-Ukraine conflict are clearer than ever. The future of the US's role in the conflict, as well as the security of Europe and the world, hinges on how this war unfolds. The US has significant interests in preventing Russia from gaining further ground in Ukraine, but it must also navigate the risks of escalation. The US has thus far managed to avoid direct confrontation with Russia, but if the conflict continues to intensify, the pressure will mount for the US to intervene more directly. The decisions made in the coming months will determine not only the fate of Ukraine, but also the trajectory of global power dynamics. For the United States, the outcome of the war is about more than just Ukraine. It's about maintaining its leadership in the global order. If the US allows Russia to succeed in Ukraine, it could embolden other authoritarian regimes and set a dangerous precedent for future conflicts. The credibility of NATO and the strength of the international order that the US has spent decades building are at risk. A failure to act decisively could lead to a diminished US influence in global affairs, a victory for Russian aggression, and the destabilization of Europe. For Russia, the stakes are existential. President Vladimir Putin has framed this war as a struggle for Russia's survival. He views NATO's expansion as a direct threat to Russia's sovereignty and security. If Russia is defeated, it could lead to internal instability and the collapse of Putin's regime. On the other hand, if Russia succeeds, it could solidify Putin's power and allow him to continue his expansionist policies. The future of Russia and the leadership of Vladimir Putin depend on the outcome of this war. A failure in Ukraine could lead to a significant shift in Russian politics and possibly even threaten Putin's grip on power. For the world, the future of the conflict has enormous implications. The economic consequences of the war have already been profound, with energy prices soaring, food supplies disrupted, and markets shaken. A prolonged conflict will only exacerbate these issues, leading to wider economic instability. The war has also sparked a global rethinking of defense strategies, with countries across Europe and the world increasing their military spending and preparing for the possibility of a broader conflict. The war in Ukraine has already reshaped the security landscape in Europe, and as the US and NATO continue to bolster their defenses, the world may see the resurgence of militarization in regions that were previously at peace. Looking forward, the question remains, how will the US, NATO, and Russia navigate this increasingly complex and dangerous situation? While no one can predict the future, one thing is certain: the outcome of the Russia-Ukraine conflict will have lasting consequences for the global balance of power. The next phase of this war will be critical not only for the people of Ukraine, but for the future of international relations. Will the US be able to prevent the conflict from escalating into a full-scale war with Russia? Or will it find itself drawn into a direct confrontation with the world's largest nuclear power? The stakes have never been higher, and the decisions made in the coming months will determine the course of history. As we conclude this analysis of the Russia-Ukraine war, it becomes increasingly clear that the global consequences of this conflict extend far beyond the borders of Ukraine. The United States, NATO, and Russia each have significant stakes in the outcome, but the future of international security and the post-World War II global order is on the line as well. As the war grinds on, we must consider not only the immediate military and political outcomes, but also the long-term ramifications for Europe, the United States, Russia, and the entire world. The ongoing conflict in Ukraine has fundamentally altered the security dynamics of Europe. The war has shattered the illusion of post-Cold War stability and reopened many of the old wounds between Russia and the West. For Ukraine, the war is not just a fight for survival. It is a battle for its identity as a sovereign nation and for its right to determine its own future. The determination of the Ukrainian people to resist Russian aggression has been extraordinary, but the cost in terms of human lives and infrastructure has been immense. As the war enters its second year, Ukraine faces a monumental challenge, both in terms of military defense and in rebuilding its war-torn country. For the United States and NATO, the central objective has been to prevent Russia from achieving its aims in Ukraine while maintaining the integrity of the NATO alliance. The US and its European allies have worked tirelessly to arm and train Ukrainian forces, impose economic sanctions on Russia, and deter any further aggression from Moscow. NATO's role in this conflict is crucial. Its very existence is tied to the success of its collective defense principle, and the alliance's commitment to Ukraine has sent a powerful message to Russia and other autocratic regimes around the world: aggression will not be tolerated. However, as NATO strengthens its eastern defenses and continues to provide Ukraine with military and economic support, the question of how far the alliance is willing to go remains unanswered. NATO has consistently ruled out direct military involvement in the conflict for fear of provoking a broader war with Russia. But as the conflict continues to escalate, the alliance faces mounting pressure to take more significant steps to counter Russia's actions. The threat of Russian expansion does not end in Ukraine. It extends to the countries of Eastern Europe, some of whom are NATO members. The security of these countries will remain under threat for as long as Russia remains unchallenged in Ukraine. On the Russian side, the situation is equally precarious. The war has placed immense strain on the Russian military, its economy, and its political structure. Despite initial setbacks and sanctions, Russia's resolve remains firm, and President Putin continues to push forward with his vision of a greater Russia, a vision that directly contradicts the post-Cold War principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity. As the war continues, Putin's future and the political stability of Russia are increasingly uncertain. If Russia is unable to secure its objectives in Ukraine, there may be serious consequences at home, both politically and economically. Public dissatisfaction with the war could escalate, especially as the toll on Russian forces mounts and economic hardship intensifies. At the same time, Russia's reliance on countries like China and Iran has grown. Moscow's diplomatic isolation from the West has led it to strengthen its ties with these authoritarian powers, which could have implications for the balance of power in Asia and beyond. However, Russia's dependence on these nations also exposes the weaknesses in its geopolitical strategy. China, while supportive of Russia in some respects, is a far more powerful and ambitious player in its own right, and its long-term interests may not align entirely with Moscow. For the world, the stakes of this conflict could not be higher. The war in Ukraine has disrupted the global economy, particularly in the areas of energy and food production. Rising energy prices and supply chain disruptions have affected not just Europe, but the entire world. Nations in Africa and the Middle East, already facing economic instability, are being hit hardest by rising food prices and the impact of the war on agricultural exports. Global economic recovery, already fragile after the COVID-19 pandemic, now faces new challenges that could take years to overcome. The political polarization sparked by the war has also rippled throughout the international community. While the US and NATO have rallied around Ukraine, other countries have been less willing to take sides. Many nations in the global south, particularly in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, have expressed neutrality or caution in response to the war, aware of the economic and diplomatic consequences of choosing sides in this conflict. Russia, for its part, has attempted to present itself as the defender of sovereignty and a counterbalance to Western imperialism, appealing to these countries by emphasizing its role as a champion of multipolarity in the international system. At the core of this conflict is the struggle for the future of global order. Will the international community uphold the principles of sovereignty, democracy, and the rule of law, or will it acquiesce to the demands of aggressive authoritarian regimes? The war in Ukraine is more than just a regional conflict. It is a reflection of broader geopolitical tensions that define the 21st century. The outcome of this war will set the tone for international relations for years to come, influencing how states interact, how global alliances are formed, and how conflicts are addressed in an increasingly multipolar world. Looking ahead, the question remains whether the US and its allies will continue to take bold steps to support Ukraine, or whether fatigue and shifting priorities will lead to a de-escalation of involvement. The US and NATO must find ways to negotiate peace while maintaining the integrity of Ukraine's sovereignty. However, as the situation continues to evolve, the possibility of a more intense confrontation with Russia remains on the table. Whether or not direct military conflict between the US and Russia becomes a reality will depend on the decisions made by both sides in the coming months. The future is uncertain, and the path forward remains fraught with peril. As the war in Ukraine continues, the entire world watches closely. The actions of the United States, Russia, and NATO will shape not only the outcome of this conflict, but also the future of global peace and stability. No matter how this war ends, one thing is clear: the world will never be the same. The lessons learned here about the resilience of nations, the dangers of unchecked aggression, and the importance of maintaining a rules-based international order will resonate for generations to come. The road to peace remains uncertain, but it is through collective action, diplomacy, and resilience that the world can hope to navigate these turbulent times. The war in Ukraine is a reminder that the cost of inaction is far greater than the cost of standing firm in the face of aggression. The outcome of this war will decide not only Ukraine's future, but the future of global security and the balance of power in the 21st century.